The silence of my home in Weston was the first thing that tasted wrong. At 64, after a lifetime spent as a senior partner at one of Boston's most prestigious forensic accounting firms, I've learned that silence is rarely empty. It's usually holding a secret it's not yet ready to give up. I pulled my sedan into the circular driveway of our estate, the gravel crunching under my tires like breaking bone. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of sweltering August day where the Massachusetts humidity clings to your skin like a damp wool blanket. I expected to see Eleanor on the porch, perhaps tending to her hydrangeas or sipping an iced tea. We had been married for 38 years, and our rhythm was as predictable as a well-balanced ledger. But the porch was empty. The front door was locked double-bolted, which was unusual for 4 in the afternoon. As I stepped into the foyer, the air conditioning hummed, but the house felt hollow. No radio playing NPR in the kitchen, no scent of the lemon roast chicken she'd promised before I left for my 3-day audit in New York. I called her name, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the great room. Eleanor? Nothing. I walked into the kitchen. Her phone was sitting on the granite island, plugged into its charger, the screen dark. Her car was in the driveway. Her purse was in the mood room. A cold, oily slick of dread began to pool in my stomach. I checked the bedrooms, the upstairs study, even the basement wine cellar. The house was a tomb of high-end furniture and quiet shadows. Then, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic thudding. It wasn't coming from inside the house. It was muffled, distant, originating from the detached 4-car garage. I ran out the back door, the heat hitting me like a physical blow. The garage was a fortress-reinforced steel doors, climate-controlled, and accessible only by a digital keypad. As I approached, the thudding turned into a desperate, wet-scratching sound. A whimper, so thin and fragile it barely sounded human, pierced the heavy air. My hands shook so violently I mistyped the security code twice. On the third attempt, the heavy door groaned open. The stench hit me first, a suffocating mix of stale sweat, urine, and the metallic tang of old fear. The garage, usually kept at a crisp 68 degrees, felt like an oven. The secondary AC unit had been switched off. In the far corner, slumped against a stack of winter tires, was Eleanor. She looked like a discarded rag doll. Her elegant silk blouse was ruined, damp with perspiration and grime. Her face, usually so composed and radiant, was gaunt, her lips cracked and bleeding, her eyes rolled back into her head. She had been clawing at the drywall near the interior door until her fingernails were jagged, bloody stumps. Eleanor. Oh God, Eleanor. I lunged for her, sliding on the concrete. I pulled her into my lap, her body shockingly light, radiating a terrifying heat. I grabbed a bottle of detailing spray from the workbench, dumped the chemicals out, and frantically filled it with water from the utility sink, pressing the wet cloth to her forehead. She let out a raspy, broken moan. Her eyelids fluttered, struggling to find my face through the haze of heat stroke. Harrison? She whispered, her voice sounding like sandpaper on stone. I'm here, El. Who did this? Was it a robbery? Did someone break in? She gripped my forearm with a strength born of pure, unadulterated trauma. Her eyes finally locked onto mine, and for the first time in nearly 40 years, I saw true terror in them. Julian, she wheezed, a tear carving a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. Julian did it. He said you'd pay the money if I was gone. The air in the garage turned to ice. My son, my only son, Julian Sterling, the boy we had given everything to, had locked his own mother in a concrete box to bake in the mid-August sun. He took my phone, she sobbed, her breath hitching in a way that made my chest ache. He sat right there, in your chair, and watched me beg through the window before he painted over the glass. Harrison, he left me to die. I didn't know it yet, but the man who entered that garage, the man who believed in order, in the law, and in the inherent goodness of his own blood, died right there on that oil-stained floor. In his place, something much older and far more dangerous was waking up. I called Chintrum Muimot, my voice a low, vibrating growl as I gave the dispatcher our address. While I waited for the sirens, I looked around the garage. It wasn't just a prison. It was a crime scene. I saw the black spray paint on the high, narrow windows. I saw the discarded zip tees on the floor, and then I saw it tucked under my workbench. It was a small, leather-bound ledger, my ledger, the one I kept for my private investments, the ones I hadn't even told Eleanor about. Julian hadn't just locked her in here to extort me. He was looking for something he thought was worth more than his mother's life. The paramedics arrived 10 minutes later, their boots thundering on the driveway. As they loaded Eleanor onto the gurney, a dark, sleek SUV pulled up to the edge of our property. It was a silver sterling vein the Matram Haimui Hungdola car I had bought Julian for his 30th birthday. The driver didn't get out. The tinted windows stayed rolled up. I stood in the center of the driveway, bathed in the red and blue strobes of the ambulance, and stared directly at the vehicle. I knew he was behind that glass. I knew he was watching to see if his problem had been resolved. The SUV sat there for a long moment, the engine idling like a growling beast, before it suddenly reversed and sped away, tires screaming against the asphalt. "Mr. Sterling?" one of the EMTs asked, touching my shoulder. "We need to move. Your wife is in critical condition. Severe dehydration, stage 2 kidney distress. We need to go now." I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the retreating taillights of my son's car. "Go," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "I'll meet you at Mass General." I didn't go to the hospital immediately. I walked back into the house, my movements slow and deliberate. I went to the bar in the study and poured a double finger of Scotch neat. My hands were perfectly steady now. The panic had been replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I picked up the house phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Alistair?" I said when the line picked up. "Harrison? It's nearly 5. I was just heading to the club. What's wrong?" "You sound different." Alistair Thorne was the most feared litigator in New England. He was a man who didn't just win cases. He erased his opponents from existence. "I need you to clear your schedule for the next 6 months, I said, staring at a framed photo of Julian on my desk, the one taken the day he graduated from Harvard, a degree I had practically bought for him. "I'm initiating a total liquidation of all family trusts. I want every asset associated with my son frozen by morning. Every bank account, every offshore holding, every deed." There was a long silence on the other end. "Harrison, that's his entire life." "What happened?" "He tried to balance a ledger using his mother's life as the currency," I replied, my grip tightening on the glass until I heard the crystal groan. "And now, I'm going to show him exactly what a total deficit looks like." I hung up and looked at the clock. It was numb, muy born PM. The betrayal was deep, but the revenge would be deeper. I thought back to the argument we'd had just 4 days ago. Julian had come to the house with his wife, Serafina, a woman who wore diamonds like armor and looked at our estate like it was a prize she was tired of waiting for. They wanted $250,000 for a once-in-a-lifetime investment in a luxury wellness resort in the Maldives. I had seen the prospectus for exactly 3 minutes before I realized it was a classic Ponzi scheme wrapped in high-end branding. "It's a scam, Julian," I had told him, sliding the glossy folder back across the mahogany table. "The numbers don't move. There's no underlying asset. You're being played." "You're just old, Dad," Serafina had snapped, her voice like a jagged shard of glass. "You're terrified of anyone else having power in this family. You want us to beg for every crumb." "I want you to be competent," I had countered. "I've given you $80,000 this year alone. Where did it go?" Julian had stood up then, his face flushing a dark, ugly purple. "You'll regret this, old man. You think you're so smart because you can count. But you don't know what it's like to actually want something." I had dismissed it as the typical tantrum of a spoiled child. I didn't realize it was a declaration of war. Now, standing in my quiet study, I realized the Maldives investment was likely a lie to cover a much darker debt. Julian was in deep with someone, and he had reached the point where his own mother was just another asset to be leveraged. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from an unknown number. "Hope the garage was nice and cool today, Dad. Maybe now you'll be more inclined to sign those papers I left in your top drawer. Checks due by Friday, or things get much, much hotter." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I walked over to my desk and opened the top drawer. There it was, a power of attorney form, already filled out, waiting for my signature. If I signed it, Julian would have total control over the Sterling family holdings. He thought he had me trapped. He thought Eleanor's life was the price of my silence. What he didn't realize was that he had just handed me the one thing a forensic accountant needs to destroy a man completely. A reason to look into every dark corner of his life. I took the scotch, walked to the shredder, and watched the power of attorney form turn into confetti. Then, I grabbed my keys. It was time to go to the hospital. But first, I had one more stop to make. I drove to the local police precinct. I didn't want a patrolman. I wanted the heavy hitters. "I'm Harrison Sterling," I told the desk sergeant, sliding my business card across the laminate. "I'd like to speak with Detective Sarah Vance regarding an attempted murder and a kidnapping." As I waited in the stark, fluorescent-lit hallway, I felt the last of my mercy evaporate. Julian had spent his life thinking money was a shield. I was about to teach him that in my hands, it was a scalpel. What happened next would change everything, but as I sat there, I realized I wasn't just grieving for my wife or my son. I was preparing for a harvest, and the crop was going to be pain. The ICU at Mass General is a place where time goes to die. It's a labyrinth of glass walls, rhythmic beeping, and the sterile scent of bleach that sticks to the back of your throat. I sat in a plastic chair that felt like a penance, watching the rise and fall of Eleanor's chest. She was hooked up to more machines than I cared to count. A ventilator hummed, doing the work her exhausted lungs couldn't quite manage. Her skin was a translucent shade of gray, the bruises on her arms, the ones from Julian's shove, turning a deep, ugly violet. I'm a man who lives by the ledger. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Every debt must be settled. But as I looked at my wife, I realized there was no math in the world that could balance what had been done to her. I felt a hollow ache in my marrow, a mixture of grief and a cold, rising fury that was starting to feel like my only source of warmth. I kept thinking back, trying to pinpoint the exact moment the rot began. People like to say that betrayal is a sudden strike, a lightning bolt from a clear sky. But as a forensic accountant, I know better. Betrayal is a slow leak. It's a tiny discrepancy in a column that you choose to ignore because you trust the person holding the pen. Julian had always been charming. It was his greatest asset and his most dangerous weapon. As a child, he could talk his way out of a broken window or a failing grade with a dimpled smile and a clever turn of phrase. I used to call it leadership potential. Now, I recognized it as the early stages of a sociopath. The first real crack appeared about 5 years ago. Julian had just finished his MBA, an expensive piece of paper from a school that valued his last name more than his transcripts. He came to me with a proposal for a boutique wealth management firm. He called it Sterling Vane Strategies. Vane was the maiden name of his new wife, Serafina. I gave him $3 million to start. It was supposed to be a loan, but in the Sterling family, loans were often just whispers of future gratitude that never materialized. Within 18 months, the firm was restructuring. A year after that, the office in the Seaport district was shuttered. Julian blamed the market. He blamed the regulators. He blamed everyone but the man in the mirror. I remember a dinner we had at the Union Oyster House shortly after the firm collapsed. Julian was wearing a $2,000 suit, ordering the most expensive bottle of Bordeaux on the list, while Serafina complained about the lack of vision in the Boston business community. "Dad," Julian had said, leaning across the table, his eyes bright with a feverish kind of intensity. "I just need a bridge loan, $50,000, just to pivot into the tech space. I've got a lead on a blockchain startup that's going to disrupt the entire payment industry." "Julian," I replied, setting my fork down, "you just lost $3 million of your mother's and my retirement capital. You haven't shown me a single P&L statement that makes sense. Where did the money go?" He didn't blink. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "It went into infrastructure, Harrison. You have to spend money to make money. You're thinking like a bookkeeper. I'm thinking like a titan." That was the first time I felt the distance between us. It wasn't just a generational gap. It was a moral canyon. I had spent 40 years building a reputation for integrity. Julian treated integrity like a garment that was currently out of fashion. I looked at Eleanor now, her hand limp in mine. She had always been his fiercest defender. "He's just finding his way, Harrison," she would say. "He has your ambition. He just hasn't found your focus yet." She had spent years shielding him from my scrutiny, smoothing over the misunderstandings, and quietly patting his bank account when I said no. And this was how he repaid her. By turning her love into a vulnerability. Around Hongam, a nurse came in to check the vitals. She was a young woman with tired eyes, and she gave me a look of such profound pity that it made me want to scream. "She's a fighter, Mr. Sterling," she whispered, adjusting the IV drip. "Her levels are stabilizing. The next 48 hours are crucial, but her heart is strong." "Thank you," I said, though my mind was already elsewhere. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the flickering lights of Boston. Somewhere out there, in a luxury penthouse I was probably still paying the mortgage on, Julian was celebrating. Or maybe he was panicking. I hoped it was the latter. I hoped he was starting to realize that the old man wasn't just a source of funds. I pulled out my phone and checked my email. Alistair Thorne had been busy. "Harrison," the email read, "all domestic accounts associated with Julian Sterling and Serafina Vane Sterling have been flagged. I've initiated a freeze based on the suspected elder abuse and the fraudulent power of attorney attempt. However, there's a complication. My team found a series of outgoing wires over the last 6 months, large sums, all heading to a holding company called Onyx Holdings. I frowned. Onyx Holdings wasn't a tech startup. It wasn't a wellness resort. We traced the beneficial owner of Onyx, the email continued. It's a shell for a man named Silas Blackwood. The name hit me like a cold spray of seawater. Silas Blackwood wasn't a businessman. He was a predator. He ran a high-stakes, off-the-books gambling operation out of a private club in the North End. He was the kind of man who didn't care about credit scores. He cared about collateral. And if Julian was wiring money to Blackwood, it meant my son hadn't just made bad investments. He was a degenerate gambler who had lost more than he could ever hope to pay back. Suddenly, the Maldives resort and the wellness industry made sense. They were lies designed to cover the holes in Julian's soul. He wasn't trying to build an empire. He was trying to keep his legs from being broken. And when I had refused the last Hai Trum Nam Mui, Hong, Dola, he must have realized he was out of time. Blackwood wouldn't wait. So Julian went for the only bilby thing he had left his inheritance. But he couldn't wait for us to die. He needed the power of attorney. He needed to be able to liquidate the Sterling estate while we were still breathing. I sat back down by Eleanor's bed, my mind racing. If Julian owed Blackwood that kind of money, he was dangerous in a way I hadn't fully grasped. A desperate man will do anything, but a desperate man with a silver tongue and a sense of entitlement is a monster. I shouldn't have been surprised when the door to the ICU suite opened quietly. I expected a doctor. I expected a detective. I didn't expect a man in a sharp, charcoal gray suit with a face like a hatchet and eyes that held no light. He wasn't Julian. He was older, mid-50s, with a heavy gold ring on his pinky finger that caught the sterile light of the room. "Mr. Sterling," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't come all the way in. He stayed by the door, his presence an immediate violation of the room's sanctity. "Who are you?" I asked, standing up. My heart was pounding, but my voice remained steady. Decades of auditing corrupt CEOs had taught me how to hide my fear. "A concerned party," the man replied. He looked at Eleanor, then back to me. "I heard about the unfortunate accident in the garage. Such a shame. Family is everything, isn't it?" "You're Silas Blackwood," I stated. It wasn't a question. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I see Julian's father has the sharp mind everyone talks about. I'm here because your son has been very vocal about your generosity, Harrison. He told me you were a man of your word, a man who values his family's safety above all else." "Get out," I said, stepping between him and Eleanor. "If you touch her, if you even breathe in her direction, I will have you buried under enough litigation and federal heat that your grandchildren will feel the chill." Blackwood chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Litigation takes time, Harrison. I don't like time. I like results. Your son owes me $2.2 million. He promised me that by Friday he'd have the authority to settle his accounts. Imagine my surprise when I heard you were freezing everything. My son is a thief and a coward," I said. "And you're a bottom feeder. You'll get nothing from me." "Is that so?" Blackwood took a step closer. The air in the room seemed to thicken. "Julian is a dead man walking. We both know that. But your wife? She's still here. For now. It would be a tragedy if her recovery was interrupted. Hospitals are such busy places. Things get misplaced. Dosages get confused." I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made my vision blur. I wanted to leap across the room and tear his throat out, but I knew that was what he wanted. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to see him as an inevitable force. "You have 24 hours to reconsider the freeze on the Sterling Vane accounts," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Julian is a fool, but he's your fool. If you don't pay his debts, I'll collect them from what's left of your life." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Oh, and Harrison? Julian didn't act alone, but you might want to ask yourself who actually suggested the garage. It's a very specific kind of cruelty. Not really Julian's style. He's too soft for the heavy lifting." He disappeared into the hallway before I could respond. I stood there, trembling with a cold, concentrated rage. Julian hadn't just betrayed us. He had invited a wolf into our home. And Blackwood's hint that Julian didn't act alone burned in my mind like a brand. I looked at Eleanor. Her eyes were open. They were glassy, unfocused, but she was looking at me. She had heard, Harrison, she croaked, her hand feebly reaching for mine. I'm here, Elle. Don't speak. It wasn't just him, she whispered, a look of profound agony crossing her face. Serafina, she was the one. She told him I wouldn't last the night in there. She said it would be over quickly. I felt my soul go dark. Julian was my blood, my failure. But Serafina was the poison he had brought into our lives. She hadn't just supported him. She had engineered the death of her mother-in-law for a payday. I leaned down and kissed Eleanor's forehead. Rest now, Eleanor. I'm going to take care of everything. What are you going to do? I looked at the black windows of the ICU, seeing my own reflection, a man who had spent his life following the rules, now realizing the rules were for people who had something left to lose. I'm going to do what I do best, Elle, I whispered. I'm going to find every hidden debt, every secret sin, and every cent they think they have. And then I'm going to audit them into the ground. What happened next was the beginning of a nightmare for my son, but as I walked out of that hospital room, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a hunter. I didn't know it yet, but Julian was already at his safe house, a luxury rental in the Berkshires. He was sitting there with Serafina, sipping champagne, waiting for the news of my cooperation. What he didn't know was that I had already made a second call. Not to the police, not to my lawyer. I had called Julian's ex-business partner, a man he had burned 3 years ago, a man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried in Sterling Vane Strategies. The game was no longer about money. It was about survival. And Julian was about to learn that when you take everything from a man who has built everything, he becomes the most dangerous person you will ever meet. I walked to my car, the Boston morning beginning to gray the sky. My phone buzzed. It was a picture of my house, my front door, and a single, red rose lying on the welcome mat. The threat was clear, but as I started the engine, I smiled. It was a cold, jagged thing. They thought I was the prey. They had no idea I was the one who had written the book on how to make people disappear without ever touching them. What happened next changed everything. And the first person to fall wasn't Julian. It was the woman who thought she was pulling the strings. I left the sterile hum of the ICU behind, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to the house in Weston. Not yet. The image of the garage door, that heavy, silent slab of steel, was burned into my retinas. Every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see the woman I'd loved for nearly 40 years. I saw the bloody, jagged fingernails and the heat-ravaged face of a stranger. I was a man who prided myself on my ability to detect anomalies, to find the 1 cent that didn't balance in a billion-dollar merger. Yet I had missed the total moral bankruptcy of my own son. Instead of going home, I drove to my war room. It was a nondescript office suite in a gray stone building near the Kensington district, registered under a holding company Julian didn't know existed. It was where I did the work that required absolute silence, the deep dive audits into corporate fraud that had made me a man both feared and respected in the financial world. I sat in the dark for a long time, the only light coming from the street lamps reflecting off the polished mahogany desk. I thought about the first time I realized Julian was different. Most parents remember the first word, or the first step. I remember the first lie. He was 8, and he'd lost $50 I'd given him for a school trip. He cried with such conviction, such heartbreaking sincerity, that I'd given him another 50. A week later, I found the original bill tucked inside a hollowed-out book, along with a collection of expensive fountain pens he'd traded for at school. He didn't need the money. He just wanted to see if he could manipulate the person who controlled the vault. I had called it resourcefulness back then. I should have called it what it was, a trial run. I turned on my computer and began the process I had performed 1,000 times for clients, but never for myself. I was auditing the life of Julian Sterling. I started with the wellness brochures I'd snatched from the kitchen table before the ambulance arrived, Oriflow International. On the surface, it looked like every other mid-tier, multi-level marketing scam, vague promises of cellular rejuvenation and financial sovereignty. But as I dug into the corporate registration in Delaware, the red flags started popping up like landmines. Oriflow wasn't just a pyramid scheme, it was a washing machine. The parent company was linked to a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, all of which eventually trickled back to Blackwood's North End interests. Julian wasn't just an investor, he was a mule. He had been using the Sterling Name My Name to recruit elite investors from the country clubs and boardrooms I frequented. He was selling a lie to my friends to pay off a debt to a monster. I felt a cold sweat prickle my neck. My son hadn't just tried to kill his mother. He had been systematically dismantling our family's reputation for months. My phone vibrated on the desk. It was an alert from the security system at the Weston estate. Someone was at the front gate. I pulled up the remote feed on my tablet. A sleek, black town car was idling at the entrance. The driver stayed inside, but the rear window rolled down just an inch. A hand emerged, flicking a cigarette butt onto my manicured lawn. It was a small gesture, but in the world of high-stakes intimidation, it was a claim of territory. Silas Blackwood was checking to see if I was home. He was reminding me that the 24-hour clock was ticking. "You're late, Silas," I whispered to the screen. "You should have realized by now that I don't negotiate with deficits." I spent the next 4 hours tracing the Tarmui, Hongdola I'd loaned Julian over the last year. I'd told Eleanor it was to help him through a market correction. I'd told myself it was just fatherly support. But as I looked at the bank tallies, I saw the truth. None of that money went to rent. None of it went to the Sterling Vane office expenses. It had all been withdrawn in cash at various casinos in Atlantic City and private gambling dens in South Boston. And then I found the pivot point. The moment the tension turned into a death spiral. It was a wire transfer from 3 weeks ago. Bornwilum, Hong. Dola moved from Julian's personal account to a high-end jewelry boutique on Newbury Street. The line item was for a custom-made diamond tennis bracelet. The same bracelet I had seen Serafina wearing during that disastrous dinner when they asked for the $250,000 investment. While Eleanor was worried about her son's business struggles, and while I was agonizing over whether to cut him off, Julian was buying jewelry to keep his wife from leaving him. Serafina wasn't just his partner, she was his handler. She was the one who demanded the lifestyle they couldn't afford, and Julian, terrified of losing the only person who validated his delusions of grandeur, was willing to do anything to provide it. I remembered the look on Serafina's face that night, the way she'd adjusted that bracelet, the diamonds catching the candlelight as she smiled at Eleanor. It was a predator's smile. She knew exactly whose blood had paid for those stones. The psychological weight of it threatened to crush me. I had spent 40 years building a legacy of precision and truth, and in the center of it, I had raised a man who was nothing but a hollowed-out vessel for greed. I thought of the early warning signs I'd dismissed as youthful indiscretion. The time he'd been caught borrowing a classmate's car in college. The administrative errors at his first internship that resulted in a 5-figure bonus he wasn't entitled to. I had been the architect of my own nightmare. By always balancing the books for him, I had taught him that the bottom line could always be manipulated if you had the right person in your corner. But the man in his corner was gone. I pulled up a new spreadsheet and labeled it Operation Liquidation. If Julian wanted to play in the world of Silas Blackwood, he was about to find out what happens when the bank doesn't just close, it retaliates. I started with the Sterling Vane lease. I'd co-signed it as a favor. I called the property manager's emergency line. "This is Harrison Sterling," I said, my voice like the snap of a winter branch. "I'm exercising the immediate termination clause on the Seaport office suite. I've already wired the penalty fee. I want the locks changed by Sao. Hong AM. Anything inside the office computers, files, furniture, is to be held as collateral for the outstanding debt to the Sterling Trust." Next, I called the manager of the luxury dealership where Julian got his cars. I knew the man. I'd handled his tax audits for years. "The silver SUV. The lease is under my corporate umbrella. I'm reporting it as an unauthorized use of company assets. I want it towed and impounded by dawn." One by one, I began to snip the threads of Julian's existence. It was a surgical strike. By the time the sun rose over the Boston harbor, Julian would wake up to find his office locked, his car gone, and his bank accounts as empty as his promises. But as I worked, a thought began to fester in the back of my mind. Silas Blackwood had said Julian didn't act alone. Eleanor had confirmed it was Serafina's idea. But how did they get into the garage without triggering the main house alarm? How did they know exactly when I would be delayed in New York? I went back to the security footage from the Weston estate not the day of the incident, but the week before. I scanned through hours of graininess until I saw it. Friday. Hi. Muy born PM. The footage showed Julian and Serafina at the front door. They weren't breaking in. They were being let in. By our housekeeper of 15 years, Mrs. Gable. I watched as Mrs. Gable handed Julian a small, silver object. It was the emergency override key to the garage, the one I kept hidden in the false bottom of the grandfather clock in the foyer. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold iron fist. Mrs. Gable was like family. She had held Julian when he was a baby. She had been the one to help Eleanor through her hip surgery last year. Why? I did a quick search on Mrs. Gable's bank records, a perk of having a private investigator on retainer who didn't ask too many questions. There it was. A deposit of Mui. Kung Dola made 4 days before I left for New York. The source? An offshore account linked to Oriflow International. They hadn't just betrayed us. They had corrupted everyone around us. They had turned our home into a nest of vipers. I sat back, the blue light of the monitor making my skin look like marble. I realized then that I couldn't just call the police and hope for a conviction. Julian and Serafina were experts at shifting blame. With a high-priced lawyer, they'd argue it was a misunderstanding, that Eleanor had locked herself in by accident, or that they'd forgotten she was there. They'd paint me as the vengeful, senile father. I needed more than a conviction. I needed a total collapse. I grabbed my coat and walked out to my car. The air was beginning to turn crisp, the first hint of autumn in the New England air. I drove toward the north end, toward the shadow of the old brick buildings, where the laws of men were often replaced by the laws of the street. If Silas Blackwood wanted his money, he was going to get it. But not from me. I parked 3 blocks away from Blackwood's Club, a windowless building with a discreet neon sign that simply said, The Onyx. I didn't go inside. I waited. 20 minutes later, a man stepped out for a smoke. He was a low-level enforcer I recognized from the PI's reports. Tell Silas that Harrison Sterling is ready to talk, I said, rolling down my window just an inch. Tell him I have a proposal that will make Julian's debt look like pocket change. But tell him if he ever comes near my house again, the next person he sees won't be me. It'll be the IRS with a warrant for every shell company he owns. The man stared at me, then nodded slowly and disappeared back inside. I drove away, my mind already 10 steps ahead. I had spent my life playing by the rules, and it had almost cost me my wife. Now, I was going to play by Julian's rules. I didn't know it yet, but the trap I was setting wasn't just for Julian and Serafina. It was for the entire world they had built on the bones of our family. What happened next would be the first true reversal, and it began with a phone call I made to Julian at exactly by Hong a.m. Julian, I said when he finally answered, his voice thick with sleep and arrogance. I've thought about your proposal. I'm ready to sign the power of attorney. Meet me at the office in the Berkshires at noon. Come alone. I knew you'd see reason, Dad, he chuckled. Serafina said you just needed a little motivation. Oh, I have plenty of motivation, Julian, I replied. More than you can possibly imagine. I hung up and looked at the silver override key I'd taken back from Mrs. Gable's quarters earlier that morning. The game was on, and Julian was walking into a room with no exit. The drive to the Berkshires was a 3-hour descent into a different kind of darkness. Outside, the Massachusetts landscape was a blur of late August greenery, the rolling hills of the Pioneer Valley shimmering in the heat. But inside my sedan, the air was set to a frigid 62 degrees. I needed the cold. I needed to feel the sharp edge of the world to remind me that I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a man who had spent 40 years quantifying the cost of human error, and I was about to deliver the final bill. The property was an old timber-framed lodge I'd bought decades ago as a retreat for the family. It sat at the end of a long, winding dirt road, surrounded by a dense forest of hemlock and pine. It was isolated, quiet, and far from the prying eyes of the Kensington social circles. It was the perfect place for a reconciliation or a reckoning. I arrived an hour early. I didn't spend the time prepping for the meeting. I spent it walking through the rooms, remembering the boy Julian used to be. I remembered him catching his first trout in the stream out back, his face beaming with a pride I'd thought was genuine. I remembered him sitting by the stone fireplace, listening to me read stories about explorers and kings. I looked for a trace of that boy in the shadows of the lodge, but all I found was the hollow echo of a life I'd funded but never truly known. What I didn't know then was that the very floorboards I was walking on were already being prepared as a stage for his final act of arrogance. At exactly noon, the sound of a high-performance engine tore through the mountain silence. I watched from the porch as the silver Sterling Vane SUV, the one I'd already reported stolen, came sliding up the gravel driveway. Julian was behind the wheel, looking every bit the titan he imagined himself to be. Beside him sat Serafina, her oversized sunglasses reflecting the lodge like the eyes of a giant insect. They stepped out of the car, and I felt a physical pang of disgust. They weren't dressed for the mountains. Julian wore a tailored linen blazer and loafers with no socks. Serafina was in a white silk jumpsuit that probably cost more than a year of Mrs. Gable's salary. They looked like they were attending a garden party, not a family meeting. "Dad, you finally came to your senses," Julian called out, his voice echoing off the trees. He walked up the porch steps with a practiced, easy stride, reaching out to clap my shoulder. I stepped back, avoiding his touch. The air between us felt thick with the ghost of the garage. "The papers are inside," I said, my voice flat. "Good. Let's get this over with." "We've got a flight to catch in the morning," Serafina said, brushing past me without a glance. Her scent, something expensive, floral, and cloying, lingered on the porch. We moved into the great room. I had laid out the power of attorney forms on the heavy oak dining table. I had also placed a single, leather-bound folder next to them. Julian pulled out a gold fountain pen, one I'd given him for his 21st birthday, and tapped it against his chin. "You know, Harrison, this is for the best. You and Mom. You're at an age where managing the Sterling Trust is just a burden. I'm going to take the family to heights you never dreamed of." "Is that what you were doing with Silas Blackwood?" I asked quietly. Julian froze. The gold pen stopped mid-tap. He glanced at Serafina, who was busy inspecting her manicure. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, though his voice had lost its smooth veneer. $2.2 million, Julian. That's a lot of infrastructure for a wellness resort. Or was that the price of your dignity at the blackjack table? I leaned against the doorframe, watching the color drain from his face. "I know about Onyx Holdings. I know about the wires. And I know about the bribe you paid Mrs. Gable to help you trap your mother." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Serafina finally looked up, her eyes cold and predatory. "So you did some digging," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "So what?" "It doesn't change the fact that you're going to sign those papers, Harrison. Because if you don't, Silas isn't going to be patient. And we both know what happens to people who owe Silas money. Especially people with high-value assets and vulnerable wives." "Is that a threat, Serafina?" "It's an audit of your current situation," she replied, mimicking my tone with a cruel smirk. "You sign the papers, we pay off the debt, and your life goes back to being quiet and boring. You don't sign, and Julian and I walk away. We've got a backup plan. But you? You'll be left with Silas, and I don't think your litigation is going to stop a bullet." Julian stepped forward, his desperation finally bubbling to the surface. "Dad, please, just sign it. Everything is falling apart. I can't stop Silas. He's already in the city. He's watching the hospital." "I know," I said. "He visited me last night." Julian's eyes went wide. "He what? And you're still breathing? What did you tell him?" "I told him that I don't negotiate with bad debts," I said. I walked to the table and picked up the leather-bound folder, not the power of attorney forms. But I also told him that I was conducting a final audit of the person who owed him that money. I opened the folder and slid a series of documents across the table toward Julian. "What is this?" he muttered, picking up the first sheet. "That is the termination of your office lease. As of 6 o'clock this morning, the Seaport office is no longer yours. Your staff has been sent home. Your servers have been seized. Every file related to Sterling Vane is currently being reviewed by a team of federal investigators I've had on retainer since Monday." Julian's hand began to shake. "You did what?" "And that," I said, pointing to the second page, "is the repossession order for the car you're driving. I reported it as an unauthorized use of corporate property. If you look out the window, you'll see the local sheriff is already at the bottom of the drive." As if on cue, the faint, blue pulse of a police light flickered through the hemlocks at the end of the long road. "You're insane," Serafina hissed, standing up so quickly her chair tumbled over. "You're destroying your own son. If he goes down, the Sterling name goes with him. You'll be a laughingstock." "The Sterling name died in a garage 3 days ago," I said, my voice rising for the first time. "It died when my wife was left to bake in 90-degree heat while her son waited for her to stop screaming. I'm not worried about the name, Serafina. I'm worried about the account." Julian was frantic now, flipping through the pages. "The bank accounts. Harrison, I can't log in. The private equity fund, the offshore, they're all grayed out. I froze them under the Patriot Act guidelines for suspected money laundering through Oriflow International," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I've spent 40 years finding the holes people like you try to hide in. Did you really think you could hide from me?" Julian collapsed back into his chair, his head in his hands. "Blackwood. He'll kill me. He'll kill me today." "Probably," I said. "But he's a businessman. He'd rather have his money than your corpse. And since I've frozen every cent you have, he knows the only way he gets paid is through me." I leaned over the table, my face inches from my son's. "I made a deal with Silas this morning, Julian. I'm going to pay him his $2.2 million. But not to save you. I'm paying him to walk away from me and your mother. As for you, he's agreed to give me 48 hours of exclusive access to your whereabouts before he resumes his collection efforts. The sheer terror in Julian's eyes was the most honest thing I'd seen from him in a decade. He looked at Serafina, but she was already backing toward the door, her white jumpsuit a stark contrast to the dark wood of the lodge. She was a rat looking for a hole. "You're not leaving, Serafina," I said, not looking at her. "The sheriff at the gate isn't just there for the car. I've turned over the security footage of you and Julian entering the house with the override key. I've turned over the bank records of the bribe to Mrs. Gable, and I've turned over Eleanor's sworn statement." "She can't testify," Serafina screamed. "She's in the ICU. She woke up this morning." I lied. I wanted to see them break. I wanted them to feel the walls closing in, just as Eleanor had felt them in that garage. And the first word she said wasn't Julian, it was arrest. Julian looked up, his face a mask of snot and tears. "Dad, please, I'm your son. You can't do this. I'll do anything. I'll go to rehab. I'll work for you. I'll apologize to Mom on my knees." "An apology doesn't balance the ledger, Julian. Only payment does." I picked up the power of attorney forms, the ones he'd been so desperate for, and slowly, meticulously, ripped them into quarters. I tossed the scraps onto his lap. "The sheriff will be up here in 5 minutes," I said. "You have a choice. You can go with them and face the felony charges for kidnapping and elder abuse. Or you can take your wife and try to outrun Silas Blackwood with $0 in your pocket and no car." What happened next changed everything, but I didn't know it yet. I thought I had them trapped. I thought the audit was over. But Julian, for all his flaws, was still a Sterling. And a Sterling in a corner is a dangerous animal. He didn't cry. He didn't beg again. Instead, a slow, ugly grin spread across his face, a mirror of the one I'd seen on Silas Blackwood. "You think you're the only one with a folder, Harrison?" Julian whispered, his voice suddenly steady. He reached into his blazer and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. He set it on the table with a sharp clack. "What is that?" "It's the audit I did on you," Julian said. "Remember the Kendall merger back in High-Lermuitarm? The one where the CEO accidentally overlooked 30 million in offshore liabilities right before you signed off on the audit?" I felt a cold prickle at the base of my spine. The Kendall merger had been the cornerstone of my career. It was a perfect audit. "I found the link, Dad," Julian said, his voice dripping with venom. "I found the ghost account that received a $5 million consulting fee 2 weeks after the merger closed. An account registered to a shell company in the British Virgin Islands. A shell company that leads right back to your private war room in the Kensington district." He stood up, towering over me for the first time in his life. "If I go to jail, Harrison, I'm taking that thumb drive to the SEC. I'm taking your reputation, your legacy, and every cent of that Sterling trust you're so proud of. You might have locked me out of the bank, but I'm the one holding the match to the vault." He looked at the door, then back to me. "Now, tell the sheriff to leave. Then, you're going to write me a check for $5 million. Not for Silas. For me. And then Serafina and I are going to disappear." I stared at the thumb drive, my mind reeling. I hadn't taken a bribe. I knew I hadn't. But in the world of forensic accounting, the truth doesn't matter as much as the trail. And Julian was a master at faking the trail. "I didn't do it," I whispered. "Doesn't matter," Julian smirked. "The numbers don't lie, remember? That's what you always taught me." Just as the first knock sounded on the heavy oak door of the lodge, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a call from the hospital. I looked at the thumb drive, then at my son, then at the door. Everything I had built was on the line. But as I reached for the phone, I realized that the escalation was far from over. Julian hadn't just found a secret. He had revealed the final twist of the knife. "Answer it, Dad," Julian taunted. "Maybe it's Mom calling to say goodbye." The ringing of the phone in my pocket felt like a rhythmic electric shock, pulsing against my thigh while the heavy oak door of the lodge groaned under the sheriff's second knock. I stood paralyzed in the center of the great room, a man caught between 3 fires. The son who had just confessed to a slow-motion murder attempt, the daughter-in-law who was a high-functioning sociopath, and the ghost of a career-ending bribe that sat on a plastic thumb drive between us. "Answer it, Harrison," Serafina said, her voice a silk-wrapped razor. She had stopped backing away. Seeing the leverage Julian held, she had reclaimed her spot by the table, her hand resting near the scraps of the power of attorney formed like she was reclaiming a throne. "Don't keep them waiting. It's rude to ignore the hospital when they're calling to tell you the woman you love is fading away." I pulled the phone out. The caller ID read Mass General, ICU. My thumb hovered over the green icon. I looked at Julian. He wasn't the boy I'd taught to fish anymore. He was a creature of pure, calculated malice, a monster I had fed with every six-figure check and every shielded mistake. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Mr. Sterling? This is Dr. Eris. I'm the attending on the floor." The doctor's voice was hurried, the background noise a cacophony of alarms and shouting. "Your wife has had a significant neurological event. We believe it's a delayed reaction to the severe heat stroke and the electrolyte imbalance. We're moving her to emergency surgery to relieve the pressure on her brain." The room seemed to tilt. The tax codes, the audits, the billions of dollars I had balanced over 4 decades, it all vanished, leaving only a vast, terrifying void. Will she survive? "I won't lie to you, Harrison. It's critical. She was asking for you before she lost consciousness. You need to get here." "On." I lowered the phone, the doctor's voice still tinny and distant in the air. Julian didn't ask if his mother was okay. He didn't ask what the doctor said. He just leaned back against the mahogany table, crossing his ankles. "Tick-tock, Dad," he said. "The sheriff is still outside. You going to let him in and lose your legacy? Or are you going to send him away so you can go say goodbye to Mom?" The third knock was louder, more authoritative. "Mr. Sterling? It's Sheriff Miller. Your car is at the gate. We need to speak with you immediately." I looked at the thumb drive. Julian's audit. In my world, a $5 million discrepancy was a death sentence. Even if I proved it was a fabrication, the mere allegation would trigger a federal review of every audit I'd conducted in the last 20 years. I would be stripped of my licenses, my partners would sue me into the dirt, and the Sterling name would be synonymous with the very fraud I had spent my life hunting. Julian knew my greatest weakness wasn't my money, it was my pride, my pristine, unyielding reputation. I walked to the door, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I opened it just a crack. Sheriff Miller was a man I'd known for a decade. He'd been to our Christmas parties. He'd helped me find a lost dog 3 summers ago. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and duty, his hand resting on the holster of his duty belt. "Harrison, we found the silver SUV. It's right behind your son's car. I've got the report here for unauthorized use, but I'm seeing Julian's car right there. Is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I could feel Julian and Serafina watching me from the shadows of the great room. I could feel the thumb drive burning a hole in the table behind me. I made a mistake, Jim," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. I had spent my life as a seeker of truth, and now, to save my wife and my name, I was becoming the very thing I despised, a concealer. "The report I filed this morning, it was a clerical error within the Sterling Trust. My son had permission to use the vehicle. I was under a lot of stress with Eleanor in the hospital, and I mismanaged the internal logs." Sheriff Miller lowered his hand from his belt, his brow furrowing. "A clerical error? Harrison, you sounded pretty certain on the phone. You mentioned kidnapping and elder abuse." I was hysterical, Jim. "Eleanor fell in the garage. It was a tragic accident, and I lashed out. I blamed Julian because I didn't want to admit I wasn't there to help her. Please, I need to get to the hospital. She's in surgery." The sheriff looked past me into the house. He saw Julian standing there, looking smug and untouchable. He saw Serafina, who gave him a small, pitying wave. Miller wasn't a fool. He knew something was wrong, but in the face of my own withdrawal of the charges, his hands were tied. "If that's how you want to play it, Harrison," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave. "But if you're in trouble, if he's doing something to you—" "I'm fine, Jim. Thank you. Just let the car stay. I'll handle the paperwork later." I closed the door and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. I felt the first real tear of the day prick my eye. I had just betrayed the law. I had just protected a criminal. "Good choice, Harrison." Serafina's voice came from right behind me. I hadn't even heard her move. "See? Being a concealer isn't so hard. It's actually quite liberating when you stop worrying about the truth." I turned around. Julia was holding the thumb drive out to me. $5 million, Dad. That's the price for the drive, and don't think about stopping the payment. The moment Serafina and I are clear of the state line, I have a scheduled email set to go to the SEC. If I don't check into a secure server and deactivate it every 6 hours, your life ends. I don't have $5 million in liquid cash sitting in a personal account, and you know it, I snarled. I froze the corporate funds, remember? "Unfreeze them," Julian said. "You're Harrison Sterling. You have the override codes. You have the private keys. Do it now, or I let the sheriff back in and tell him you're bribing me to keep quiet about the Kendall murder. I walked to my laptop, my fingers trembling as I entered the decryption keys for the Sterling Trust. I felt like I was disassembling my own soul. Every clue radically was a betrayal of my partners, my clients, and the woman currently under a surgeon's knife. I initiated the transfer. $5 million moved from the trust's contingency fund to an anonymous offshore account Julian provided. There, I said, slamming the laptop shut. It's done. Give me the drive. Julian tossed it to me. It felt cold and heavy in my palm. Pleasure doing business with you, Harrison. We'll be in touch about the deactivation. But for now, we have a flight to catch. Silas is going to be very happy to get his cut, and Serafina and I are going to enjoy a very long, very expensive vacation. They walked out of the lodge without a backward glance. I watched through the window as they climbed into the silver SUV, the car that was supposed to be impounded, and sped down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust that choked the mountain air. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, clutching the thumb drive and the phone that had brought me the news of Eleanor's brain surgery. I felt hollowed out, a husk of a man who had traded his integrity for a lie and a few more hours of a reputation that was already rotting from within. I didn't know it yet, but the real horror wasn't the $5 million or the blackmail. The real horror was what I found when I finally plugged that thumb drive into my computer. I expected to see forged bank statements. I expected to see doctored emails. What I saw instead was a video. It wasn't a video of a bribe. It was a video taken by a hidden camera in my own home office in Weston. The date was from 4 months ago. The video showed me sitting at my desk, late at night. I looked exhausted, rubbing my eyes as I looked at a series of documents. And then, the door opened. It was Julian. He didn't look like a monster in the video. He looked like a son. He walked over and hugged me, then sat on the edge of the desk. We talked for 20 minutes. The video had no sound, but the body language was clear. We were laughing. I looked happy. And then I watched as the Harrison on the screen opened a drawer, pulled out an envelope, and handed it to Julian. Julian opened it, showed the contents to the camera for a split second, a stack of $100 bills, and tucked it into his jacket. Then, the screen went black, and text appeared. The first debt, May Muhayeth. Namui, $100 cash. No logs. No audit. Just a father buying his son's silence. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. I remembered that night. I remembered giving him the money, but I hadn't been buying his silence. He had told me he was in trouble with a legitimate lender, that he'd made a mistake with a client's portfolio, and needed to make it right before the audit. I had given it to him to save his career. I had given it to him out of love. But Julian had recorded it. He had staged the lighting, the angle, everything to make it look like a payoff. He had been planning this for months. He hadn't just reacted to the garage incident. He had been building a case against me since the spring. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Julian didn't just want my money. He wanted to prove that I was exactly like him. He wanted to pull me down into the mud so he wouldn't have to feel the weight of his own failures. My phone buzzed again. A text from Julian. Check the second folder, Dad. The one labeled Firm Secrets. You aren't the only one who knows how to find a leak. I opened the second folder. My heart stopped. It contained internal memos from my firm, Sterling, Hayes, Ross, confidential client data, trade secrets. And at the bottom of every document was a digital signature from my junior partner, Marcus Hayes. Marcus was the man I had mentored for 10 years. He was the man I was planning to hand the firm to when I retired. And according to these documents, Marcus had been feeding Julian information for months. He had been the one providing the technical details Julian needed to make his blackmail believable. I wasn't just being hunted by my son. I was being dismantled by the very people I had built my life around. I fell to my knees in the middle of the great room, the silence of the mountains suddenly deafening. I was a man who had spent his life detecting fraud, and I had been the biggest fool of all. I had been surrounded by vipers, and I had called it a family and a career. I reached for my phone to call the hospital, to check on Eleanor, but as my fingers touched the screen, a new notification appeared, a news alert from the Boston Globe. Breaking. Prominent forensic accountant Harrison Sterling under investigation for tax evasion and corporate bribery. Sources claim massive irregularities in Kendall merger. The deactivation hadn't happened. Julian hadn't waited 6 hours. He had sent the files the moment he hit the pavement of the main road. He had taken my $5 million and destroyed me anyway. I sat there in the dark lodge, the blue light of the laptop illuminating my face like a death mask. I had lost my wife's health, my son's soul, my partner's loyalty, and my life's work in the span of an afternoon. I felt a cold, sharp stillness settle over me. The kind of stillness that comes when you've hit the absolute bottom of the abyss. There was nowhere left to fall. But as I looked at the video of Julian and me on the screen, a tiny detail caught my eye, something I had missed in my panic. In the video, on the desk next to the envelope of money, was my coffee mug. A specific mug Eleanor had given me for our anniversary. And next to it was a calendar. The calendar on the desk said Mai Moi Haith. But I hadn't been in Boston on Mai Moi Haith. I had been in London for a conference. I had the flight records, the hotel receipts, the speaking engagement photos to prove it. I leaned closer to the screen. I looked at the Harrison in the video. The lighting was dim, the grain heavy. The man looked like me, moved like me, but he was wearing a ring on his right hand. I never wear a ring on my right hand. Julian hadn't just recorded a payoff. He had hired an actor. He had deep-faked the entire encounter using the surveillance footage from my own office. A slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. Julian thought he was a master of the audit. He thought he could manipulate the numbers and the images to create a reality. But he had forgotten the first rule of forensic accounting. The smallest detail is always the one that brings the whole house down. I stood up, my legs no longer shaking. I wasn't going to the hospital yet. I couldn't help Eleanor if I was in handcuffs. I reached for my phone and dialed Silas Blackwood. "Silas," I said, my voice as cold as the deep Atlantic. "The $5 million I sent to Julian? I've already alerted the bank that it was a fraudulent transfer under duress. The funds will be clawed back within the hour. Your client is currently fleeing toward the border in a stolen vehicle with 0 assets. You're playing a dangerous game, Harrison," Blackwood's voice crackled. "You promised me that money. And you'll get it," I said. "But first, I'm going to give you Julian's real-time GPS coordinates. He's driving the silver SUV. And Silas? Tell your men not to be gentle. He's got something on him that belongs to me. A thumb drive. I want it back. And I want him to watch while you give it to me." I hung up. I had just traded my son to a monster. But as I walked out of the lodge into the cool mountain air, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like the man who was about to show the world what happens when you try to audit a master. The escalation was over. The collapse was beginning. And Julian Sterling was about to learn that you never, ever bet against the man who knows where every cent is buried. I didn't know it yet, but the real twist wasn't the fake video. It was who had actually hired the actor. And it wasn't Julian. I drove back toward Boston with a cold, hollow intensity that made the 3-hour journey feel like a 30-second blur. My phone sat on the passenger seat, glowing with notifications I refused to touch. The news of my supposed downfall was spreading like a virus through the financial districts of the world, but all I could see was the grain of that deepfake video. Julian had used my own face, my own sanctuary, and the love I had for him to craft a noose. But the actor in the video, the one wearing the ring on his right hand, was the loose thread that would unravel their entire tapestry. I didn't head to the hospital first. I couldn't. If I walked into that ICU, while the world thought I was a criminal, I'd be bringing the police right to Eleanor's bedside. Instead, I bypassed the Kensington office and drove to an old, windowless data center in Quincy. It was a facility I'd audited years ago, and in exchange for my discretion regarding their cooling system failures, the owner had given me a black box, a server rack that was entirely off the grid, accessible only by a physical key and a biometric scan. Inside the hum of the server room, surrounded by the smell of ozone and recycled air, I began the counter-audit. I needed to know who had actually paid that actor. Julian didn't have the technical sophistication to commission a high-level deepfake, and he certainly didn't have the patience to stage it so perfectly. He was a creature of impulse. This was a work of architecture. I plugged the thumb drive into the air-gapped terminal. I didn't look at the video this time. I looked at the metadata. I looked at the rendering timestamps. I tracked the digital breadcrumbs back through 3 different VPNs and a convoluted series of onion routers. It took me 4 hours of concentrated, squinting labor, the kind of work that had made my reputation in the 90s, before the software did the heavy lifting for us. And then, I found the payment. It wasn't $5 million. It was $50,000, paid in Bitcoin to a boutique visual effects house in Kyiv. I traced the wallet that sent the Bitcoin. It had been funded by a shell company called Aegis Consulting. I dug deeper, peeling back the layers of Aegis until I found the beneficial owner. My heart which I thought had already been turned to stone, fractured again. The owner of Edges Consulting wasn't Julian. It wasn't even Serafina. It was Marcus Hayes, my partner, my protégé, the man I had treated like a second son for a decade. Marcus had been the one to hire the actor. He had been the one to provide the interior photos of my office. He had even been the one to leak the irregularities of the Kendall merger to the Globe. Julian hadn't been the architect of this conspiracy. He had been the weapon. Marcus had used my son's desperation and his wife's greed to create a diversion. While I was focused on saving Julian, or punishing him, Marcus was moving to take over the firm. He was using the scandal to trigger the morality clause in our partnership agreement, which would allow him to buy out my 51% stake for pennies on the dollar. I sat back in the ergonomic chair, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. The betrayal was absolute. It was a ba trum sao mua degree circle of knives. My son had provided the blood, and my partner had provided the blade. But as I looked at the transaction logs for Edges Consulting, I saw one more thing. A series of smaller payments made over the last 3 months to a private medical facility in Switzerland. The patient name was redacted, but the billing address was Marcus Hayes' personal residence. I did a quick cross-reference with Marcus's insurance records, another perk of our firm's deep access protocols. Marcus wasn't just stealing the firm. He was dying. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. He didn't want the legacy for himself. He wanted the liquidation value to set up a massive offshore trust for his own family before he exited the stage. He was a man with nothing to lose, which made him more dangerous than Julian could ever dream of being. I finally drove to Mass General around midnight. The lobby was quiet, the security guards distracted by the late-night news on the wall. I slipped past them using my old board member badge, which luckily hadn't been deactivated yet. Eleanor's room was dark, save for the flickering light of the monitors. She was out of surgery, her head wrapped in white gauze, her face still horribly pale but no longer contorted in pain. The surgeon had relieved the pressure, but she was in a medically induced coma to allow her brain to heal. I sat by her side and took her hand. It was cold, the fingers still stained with the ink of the forensic team that had processed her as a crime scene. "I'm so sorry, Elle," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. I taught him the math, but I forgot to teach him the soul. And I let a wolf sit at our table for 10 years, because he knew how to balance a ledger. I stayed there for an hour, the rhythmic whoosh click of the ventilator the only sound in the room. In that hour, the last of Harrison Sterling, the respected CPA, died. I realized that to win this, I couldn't be the man who followed the rules. I had to be the man who wrote the rules for people who wanted to break them. I pulled out my phone and made 3 calls. The first was to Alistair Thorne. "Alistair, I need you to file a secret injunction against the board of Sterling, Hayes, Ross. Cite internal embezzlement by Marcus Hayes. Use the Edges Consulting files I just sent to your secure server. Don't go to the police yet. Just lock him out of the building. I want him to arrive tomorrow morning and find his keycard dead and his office empty." The second call was to a contact at the SEC, a man who owed me his career after I'd helped him take down a hedge fund kingpin in Hang In Lair Haimui Hai. "Check the Kendall merger files again," I told him. "Look at the digital signatures. They weren't mine. They were forged using an administrative override key, and then check Marcus Hayes' private server for the source code of that override." The third call was the hardest. It was to the cell phone of the actor Julian had hired the man with the ring on his right hand. I'd found his name in the visual effects house's email logs. Leo Vance. "Mr. Vance," I said when he answered, his voice sounding groggy and confused. "You don't know me, but you spent a day in a studio pretending to be me. I'm the man whose life you helped ruin for $50,000. But I'm also the man who knows about the 2 other roles you played for Marcus Hayes in the last year, roles that involved falsified testimony in a grand jury hearing." There was a long, terrifying silence on the other end. I don't know what you're talking about. "You have 2 choices, Leo. You can wait for the FBI to knock on your door, or you can meet me at the public garden in 20 minutes. I'm going to give you a chance to play the most important role of your career, the whistleblower." I kissed Eleanor's forehead and walked out of the hospital. I felt a strange, cold lightness in my chest. I had been audited, and I had been found wanting, but the final reconciliation was coming, and I was the one holding the red pen. I met Leo Vance on a bench near the Swan boats. He was younger than I expected, with the kind of versatile, forgettable face that made him a perfect chameleon. He was trembling, his eyes darting around the shadows of the park. "Marcus told me it was just a corporate training video," Leo stammered. "He said you were in on it. He said it was for an internal security test, He lied to you, Leo, just like he lied to me. But here's the reality. Marcus is dying. He won't be around to protect you when the feds start asking about the deep fake. But I will be. I handed him a manila envelope. Inside is a statement. It details exactly how Marcus coached you, how he provided the props, and how he paid you. You're going to sign it in front of my lawyer tonight. And then, you're going to make one more video for me. What kind of video? A confession, I said. But not to the public. To Julian. I spent the rest of the night in a frantic, cold-blooded sprint. By Born, Hong AM, I had the signed statement. By Num, Hong AM, I had the confession video from Leo. And by Sao, Hong AM, I was parked outside the Onyx in the North End. I didn't go in for Silas Blackwood. I went for the man who was waiting for him. Julian's silver SUV was parked in the alleyway. He was sitting in the driver's seat, his head back, his eyes closed. Serafina was gone, likely at a hotel nearby, waiting for the all-clear. Julian looked pathetic, a shell of a man who had sold his mother and his father, and had found out the price wasn't nearly high enough. I tapped on the window with the heavy gold ring I'd taken from my study, the one Julian had seen the actor wearing in the video. Julian jumped, his eyes snapping open. When he saw me, his face went a sickly shade of green. He tried to start the engine, but I'd already had Silas's men pull the spark plugs while he was sleeping. "The car's dead, Julian," I said, my voice echoing in the narrow alley. "Just like your leverage." I held up my phone and pressed play on Leo Vance's confession. Julian watched as the man who had played his father explained exactly how Marcus Hayes had orchestrated the entire frame-up. He watched as Leo showed the ring, the props, and the email chain where Marcus had told him to make sure Julian thinks he's the one in control. Julian stared at the screen, his jaw hanging slack. "Hey, Marcus?" But Marcus said he was on my side. "He said you were going to cut me out of the will regardless. Marcus used you to destroy me so he could pick the bones of the firm, Julian. He didn't care about your debt to Silas. He didn't care about your mother. He just wanted a distraction while he liquidated the Sterling Trust." I leaned into the window, the scent of his fear filling the small space. "You're not a titan, Julian. You're a pawn. And you're a pawn who's about to lose his queen. Serafina isn't at the hotel. I had my PI tracker an hour ago. She's at the airport, Julian. She has the 5 million, or she thinks she does. I let the transfer go through to a secondary account I controlled. Then I gave her the access codes. She left me. The moment the money hit the screen, she didn't even pack your bags." Julian let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. It was the sound of a man realizing his entire world was a hallucination. "So what now?" he whispered. "You going to kill me? Or is Silas going to do it?" "Neither," I said. "I'm an accountant, Julian. I don't kill people. I just settle their accounts." I pulled out a second phone, the one with the GPS tracker for Serafina's new account. "I've already alerted Silas that the 5 million is with Serafina at Logan Airport. He's on his way there now. And I've alerted the Port Authority that she's carrying stolen corporate funds." I looked at my son, and for the first time, I felt nothing. No anger, no love, just the flat, cold realization of a zero balance. "You're going to walk into that police station over there," I said, pointing toward the end of the alley. "You're going to confess to the kidnapping and the elder abuse. You're going to tell them everything Marcus Hayes did. And in exchange, I won't tell Silas where you're being held." "Dad, please, don't," I snapped. "You have 10 minutes before I call Silas and tell him you're still in the city. Make your choice." I walked away, leaving him in the dead SUV. I didn't look back to see if he went to the station. I knew he would. Julian was a coward, and a coward always chooses the cage over the wolf. But as I drove back toward the hospital, my phone buzzed. It was Silas Blackwood. "Harrison," he said, his voice unusually tight. "We're at the airport. We found the woman. But there's a problem." "What problem?" "She has the money. She has a suitcase, Harrison, but it's not full of money. It's full of documents. Documents from your house. And there's a note in here for you. It says, 'The garage was just the beginning. Check the basement.'" I slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming. The basement. In my house in Weston, the basement wasn't just storage. It was where the main gas line entered the building. And it was where Eleanor kept her collection of vintage films, thousands of rolls of highly flammable nitrate. I realized then that Serafina wasn't just a greedy wife. She was the failsafe. And Marcus Hayes hadn't just wanted the firm. He wanted to erase the Sterlings entirely. "Harrison, you there?" Blackwood asked. I didn't answer. I pulled a U-turn, the world blurring into a red haze. I had audited everyone, but I had missed the most important thing. The man who has nothing to live for doesn't want your money. He wants your ghost. What happened next changed everything. And the final twist was waiting in the dark of my own home. The tires of my sedan screamed as I pulled a violent U-turn on the shoulder of Route Tarm, the smell of burning rubber filling the cabin. I didn't care about the state troopers or the morning commute. My mind was a frantic, clicking calculator, tallying the transit time from the airport to Weston. If Silas's men had found Serafina at Logan, that meant she'd had enough time to plant whatever she'd planned and get out. The note she'd left check the basement wasn't just a taunt, it was a countdown. I pushed the car to 90, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles felt like they might burst through the skin. I've spent my life studying the volatility of markets, the way a single rumor can turn a blue-chip stock into a penny dreadful overnight. But as I raced toward my home, I realized I was looking at the ultimate volatility, the total destruction of my history. The basement wasn't just where the gas line entered, it was the archive of the Sterling family. Thousands of feet of nitrate film, dating back to my grandfather's era. Nitrate is beautiful, but it's chemically unstable. It's essentially solid gasoline. If a fire started down there, the house wouldn't just burn, it would detonate. I didn't know it yet, but the trap wasn't meant to kill me. It was meant to erase the evidence of the life I had built, leaving only the fraudulent records Marcus had planted. I tore into the driveway of the Weston estate at Sar, Bournemouth AM. The house sat there, bathed in the soft, deceptive light of a New England dawn, looking as stoic and untouchable as ever. But as I approached the front door, my phone buzzed with a system failure notification from the smart home app. The locks were unresponsive. The security cameras were looping a feed from 2 hours ago. Marcus Hayes had used the administrative override to shut me out of my own fortress. I didn't waste time with the door. I grabbed a heavy iron lawn ornament, a decorative stag, and smashed the glass of the French doors leading into the study. The sound of the shattering crystal was a gunshot in the morning silence. I vaulted over the frame, my shoes crunching on the shards, and ran toward the basement door. The smell hit me before I even opened the latch. Not smoke, gas. Heavy, sweet, and suffocating. I held my breath, pulled my shirt over my nose, and descended the wooden stairs. The basement was a labyrinth of shadows, the only light coming from the small, high windows. I moved toward the far corner, where the nitrate archive was kept in climate-controlled lockers. And then I saw it. A small, rhythmic blue spark, crackling in the dim light. It was a crude but effective device, a simple spark gap generator wired to a digital timer, sitting directly beneath the main gas intake valve. The valve had been wrenched open. The timer was counting down. 4 minutes. In 4 minutes, the spark would find the pooling gas, and the nitrate films would do the rest. I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury for those who don't understand systems. I am a man of the ledger. I know how to stop a leak. I reached for the main shutoff valve, but it had been stripped. The wheel was gone, replaced by a jagged, greased stub. I looked around for a tool, my lungs burning, my vision starting to swim from the fumes. I found a heavy pipe wrench on the workbench, but as I lunged for it, I tripped over a box that hadn't been there before. The box was open. Inside were files. Not my files. Eleanor's. I froze. The timer ticked ba. Bon mulam. I grabbed the top folder. It was a ledger from Tarm, the year of the Kendall merger. But this wasn't the corporate ledger I had audited. It was a private one, written in Eleanor's elegant, flowing hand. I scanned the pages, my heart stopping. Mai Mui Bornth. Transfer from Marcus H. Hai Hung Hung. Dola purpose. Debt settlement for Julian. Note. Harrison must never know. The firm is too fragile. I felt the world collapse around me. The rock bottom I thought I'd hit in the lodge was nothing compared to this. The bribe from the Kendall merger hadn't been a deep fake. The money had been real. But it hadn't gone to me. It had gone to Eleanor. She had taken the money from Marcus 5 years ago to pay off Julian's early gambling debts to keep me from finding out our son was a failure. She had made a deal with the wolf to save the shepherd's pride. And Marcus had kept the receipts. He hadn't just been framing me. He'd been holding this over Eleanor for half a decade. That was why she'd been so defensive of him. That was why she'd insisted we trust him. She wasn't his accomplice. She was his prisoner. Nummui. The blue spark crackled again. The air was so thick with gas I could feel it on my skin. I grabbed the wrench, slammed it onto the valve stub, and threw my entire weight against it. The metal groaned, the grease slicking my hands, but it didn't budge. I screamed a raw, guttural sound of frustration and grief, and heaved again. Crack. The valve turned. The hissing sound of the gas died away. I didn't wait. I grabbed the spark generator and hurled it toward the small basement window, the plastic casing shattering as it flew out into the wet grass of the lawn. I collapsed onto the concrete floor, gasping for clean air that wasn't there, clutching Eleanor's secret ledger to my chest. I sat there in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of my family's history, and realized that my entire life was a lie of my own making. I had been so obsessed with the truth of the numbers that I had missed the tragedy of the people. Eleanor had sacrificed her soul to protect my ego, and Marcus had used that sacrifice to build his empire. What happened next was the true reversal. I didn't call the police. I didn't call the fire department. I crawled out of the basement, my lungs raw and bleeding, and sat on the back porch. I watched the sun rise fully over the Weston Hills, and I felt a cold, surgical precision take hold of me. Marcus Hayes thought he had erased me. He thought that by threatening to burn the house, he had forced my hand. But he'd made a mistake. He'd left the ledger. He'd assumed I would be too broken by Eleanor's betrayal to use it. He forgot that I am an auditor. And an auditor doesn't care about the reason for the debt. He only cares about the trail. I picked up my phone. I didn't call Silas. I didn't call the FBI. I called Marcus Hayes' private nurse. "This is Harrison Sterling," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "I'm looking at the Aegis Consulting records. I see the payments for Marcus's treatment in Switzerland, but I also see the pharmacy orders. Marcus isn't taking oncology meds, is he, Sarah? He's taking high doses of immunosuppressants." There was a long, sharp intake of breath on the other end. I can't discuss a patient's. He doesn't have cancer," I said. It was a gamble, a deduction based on the volatility of his behavior. He had a transplant. A black market organ, funded by the Sterling Trust. That's why he needs the liquidation. He's not dying of cancer. He's trying to pay off the people who acquired his new heart. The silence confirmed everything. Marcus wasn't a tragic villain seeking a legacy. He was a parasite who had literally stolen life from the firm. "Tell Marcus I'm coming for him," I said. "Tell him the audit isn't over. It's just moved to the heart of the matter." I hung up and stood. The grief was gone, replaced by a terrifying, crystalline focus. I had hit rock bottom, and I'd found the bedrock. I walked to my study, opened the wall safe, and pulled out the one thing Marcus didn't know I had, a recording of the partnership meeting from High in Lair Moitarm. Not a digital one he could hack, but an old-fashioned micro-cassette. I listened to Marcus's voice from 5 years ago, smooth and reassuring, as he talked about the Kendall merger. And then I heard the faint, rhythmic clicking of his pen. A specific pattern. A code we'd used in the firm for years to signal off-book transactions. He'd been mocking me even then. I didn't know it yet, but the final revenge plan wasn't going to happen in a courtroom. It was going to happen in the one place Marcus felt safest, his own vanity. I spent the next 3 hours setting the margin call. I moved the frozen Sterling funds into a honeypot account that looked like a vulnerable, unencrypted payout. I knew Marcus's desperate creditors would see it. I knew they would move on it. And I knew that the moment they touched that money, the digital signature would link back not to me, but to the Swiss facility where Marcus had received his heart. I was going to trigger a recall on his life. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "The hospital is calling you, Harrison. But you should know. Serafina wasn't at the airport for the money. She was there for the surgeon. Marcus's heart is failing. He needs a replacement. And Julian is the only match we could find on short notice." I felt the air leave my lungs again. The garage, the gas, the ledger, it was all a distraction. The real harvest wasn't the money, it was Julian. They hadn't just betrayed the family. They were going to strip mine my son for parts. What happened next changed everything. And the final twist was a race against a scalpel. I drove like a man possessed, the engine of my sedan screaming as I tore through the morning traffic of the Seaport district. My mind was no longer a calculator. It was a map of every secret hallway and utility room I'd approved in the design of the Sterling Hayes Ross headquarters. I realized now why Marcus had insisted on a state-of-the-art private medical suite on the top floor. He'd sold it to the board as a perk for high-value clients, but it was his own personal repair shop, a sanctuary, where he could swap out failing parts of himself using the firm's untraceable capital. The lobby was a ghost town, the security guards already sent home by the administrative override Marcus had triggered. I didn't use the elevator. I knew he'd have it locked. I ran for the service stairs, my lungs burning, the cold fire of the gas I'd inhaled in the basement still clawing at my throat. I reached the penthouse floor, my vision blurring, and saw the red "Surgery in Progress" light glowing above the reinforced steel doors of the medical wing. I didn't knock. I used the heavy iron pipe wrench I'd brought from the basement and smashed the glass bypass panel. The alarm didn't sound. Marcus had disabled the entire floor's security to ensure his procedure stayed off the books. I burst into the operating theater. The room was a blinding, sterile white, smelling of ozone and iodine. Marcus was there, laid out on a table, already prepped, his chest marked with surgical ink. Julian was on the adjacent table, hooked to a sedative drip, his face pale and slack. Serafina stood between them, no longer the grieving wife or the frantic traveler. She was wearing surgical scrubs, her eyes as sharp and cold as the scalpel she was holding. "You're too late, Harrison," she said, her voice echoing in the tiled room. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked bored. "The transport team is 5 minutes out. Marcus's body is already rejecting the old heart. He needs the fresh one today, or the Sterling Hayes empire dies with him." "He's your father, Julian," I gasped, leaning against the wall for support. I looked at Marcus, then back at Serafina. "But who are you, Serafina? You aren't a wife. You're the insurance policy, aren't you?" Marcus's eyes flickered open, heavy with anesthesia, but still burning with a desperate animal greed. She is my legacy. Harrison," he wheezed. "Your son was always just a donor. From the moment he married her, he was just a long-term investment. Serafina isn't just my assistant. She's my daughter." The final piece of the ledger clicked into place. The Vane in Sterling Vane. Serafina Vane wasn't just a clever name. It was the name of Marcus's first wife, the one he'd erased from his history years ago. He had planted his own daughter in Julian's path, groomed her to manipulate my son's weaknesses, and waited for the day his own body would fail. Julian hadn't just been betrayed by a wife. He'd been raised like livestock by a father-in-law who saw him as nothing more than a biological safety net. "You're not taking him," I said, stepping forward. I raised the pipe wrench, but my hand was shaking. "And what are you going to do, Harrison?" Serafina mocked, stepping toward Julian's table. "You're an old man who plays with numbers. I'm a woman who knows exactly how much a life is worth on the open market. I've already authorized the payout to Silas. Your son is the only thing left that can pay his debt to my father." "You forgot the margin call, Serafina," I said. I pulled out my phone and held it up. The screen was scrolling with a series of red alerts. I didn't just freeze the trust. I linked the medical suite's life support systems to the honeypot account I set up 3 hours ago. The moment Silas's men tried to withdraw the liquidation funds, it triggered a total system lockout. As if on cue, the lights in the operating room flickered and died. The hum of the ventilators and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitors dropped into a low, mechanical moan as the backup generators failed to kick in. "What did you do?" Serafina screamed, her composure finally breaking as the room plunged into a terrifying, dim emergency light. "I didn't kill him," I said, watching Marcus's monitor flatline as the power died. "I just performed an audit on his life. He tried to steal a heart he didn't earn, with money he didn't own. And in my world, when the collateral is gone, the contract is void." Marcus let out one final, rattling breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated deficit, and went still. The man who had tried to play God with my family had been brought down by the very thing he'd used to build his empire. A digital glitch. Serafina lunged for me, her face a mask of rage, but the doors to the suite burst open. It wasn't Silas's men. It was Alistair Thorne, flanked by a dozen federal agents and the Boston PD. "Harrison Sterling?" One of the agents called out, his weapon drawn. "We have the warrant for Marcus Hayes and Serafina Vane. Step away from the tables." I didn't step away. I walked over to Julian and pulled the sedative drip from his arm. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel revenge. I just felt a profound, weary sadness for the boy who had been so desperate for a father's love that he'd walked right into a slaughterhouse. The aftermath was a slow, methodical clearing of the books. It took 6 months to untangle the mess Marcus had left behind. The Kendall merger was re-audited, and while my reputation took a hit, the evidence of Marcus's forgery and Eleanor's coerced involvement was enough to keep me from the inside of a prison cell. My firm, however, was gone. I liquidated the remaining assets, paid off every creditor, and shuttered the doors of Sterling, Hayes, Ross for good. I didn't want a legacy built on a foundation of bones. Julian woke up 48 hours after the surgery. He was alive, but the man who had dreamed of being a titan was gone. He was broken, facing 10 years in a minimum security facility for his role in the kidnapping and the embezzlement. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for Serafina. He just asked for his mother. Serafina vanished. Some say she's in Switzerland, living off the remnants of Marcus's offshore accounts. Others say Silas Blackwood caught up with her before she reached the border. I don't look for her. I don't need to. In the end, she was just another bad debt. And I've learned that some accounts are better left uncollected. Eleanor came home in October, just as the leaves in Weston were turning a brilliant, defiant red. The brain surgery had left her with a slight tremor in her right hand, and a memory that was sometimes like a frayed cable, but she was alive. We moved out of the Weston estate and bought a small, quiet cottage on the coast of Maine, far from the gray steeples of Boston and the cold glass of the seaport. One evening, as the tide was pulling the Atlantic back from the shore, Eleanor and I sat on the porch, watching the light fade. She was holding a ledger, not a corporate one, but a book of sketches she'd started. "Harrison?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "Yes, El?" "The numbers. Do they finally balance?" I looked at her, then out at the vast, indifferent ocean. I thought about Julian in his cell, about Marcus in his grave, and about the $50,000 I'd spent to find a man with a ring on his right hand. "They don't, Eleanor," I said, taking her trembling hand in mine. "And I think that's the point. You can't audit a life. You can only live it, one day at a time, and hope that when the final tally is called, the love was worth the cost of the lies." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in my 64 years, I didn't think about the future or the past. I didn't think about discrepancies or deficits. I just listened to the sound of her breathing, a rhythmic, beautiful proof of life that no ledger could ever contain. The Sterling family was over. The empire was dust. But as the stars began to poke through the Maine sky, I realized I was finally a wealthy man. Not because of what I had, but because of what I'd been willing to lose to find the truth. The ledger was closed. And for the first time, the balance was exactly where it needed to be.